Have you ever felt completely hooked by a story from the very first moment? Studies show that our brains are wired to connect with great stories, and the one I'm about to share might be the most powerful you've ever heard. Get ready for a journey filled with tension, courage, and moments that will truly touch your heart. In today's video, you'll discover an incredible story that proves how loyalty and fate can change lives forever. So, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, without further ado, let's dive in. The wind howled through the vast, snow-covered plains of Montana, carrying with it a bitter cold that could slice through even the thickest of coats. The sky was an unforgiving shade of gray, heavy with the weight of an impending storm. The wooden cabin stood resolute in the middle of the frozen wilderness, its logs worn and weathered from years of enduring the brutal winters. Smoke curled from the chimney, the only sign of life in this remote part of the world. Inside the cabin, Walter Reed sat near the wood-burning stove, watching the flames dance in the dimly lit room. His hands, gnarled and calloused from decades of hard labor, rested on his lap. His face was a map of deep lines and wrinkles, not just from age but from years of solitude and sorrow. A once respected horse trainer, Walter had spent the last decade living alone, his only company the whispering wind and the occasional visit from the town's supply man. Life had not always been this quiet. There was a time when the cabin was filled with warmth, with laughter echoing off its wooden walls. But that was before the accident, before the loss that had drained the color from his world. Now, the only sounds that accompanied him were the crackling fire and the occasional groaning of the wooden beams under the weight of the snow. As Walter took a sip of his coffee, strong, black, and nearly as bitter as the wind outside, he heard something, a noise that did not belong to the usual symphony of winter, a faint, distant whinny. He frowned, setting his coffee down. Horses were rare in this part of Montana, especially in the dead of winter. He hadn't seen a wild Mustang in years, not since the government had started cracking down on free-roaming herds. Grabbing his coat from the rack, he pulled it over his thick flannel shirt and slipped on his heavy boots. Stepping outside, the cold hit him like a slap to the face. The wind carried flurries of snow, biting into his exposed skin. Walter narrowed his eyes against the icy gusts and scanned the landscape. Then he saw them. About 50 yards away, standing near the edge of his property, were two figures barely visible against the white backdrop, a mare and her foal. The mare, a tall and sturdy creature with a coat the color of storm clouds, stood protectively over her foal, her body tense and alert. The foal, smaller and noticeably weaker, shivered uncontrollably. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath its thin coat, and it struggled to keep its legs from buckling beneath it. Walter's heart clenched. He had seen enough horses in his lifetime to know what he was looking at, a mother desperate to keep her baby alive. The mare lifted her head, nostrils flaring, eyes fixed on him with a wary intensity. Walter didn't move. He knew better than to startle a wild horse, especially one protecting her young. For a long moment, they stared at each other, the howling wind the only sound between them. "Where the hell did you two come from?" he muttered under his breath. The mare pawed at the snow, hesitant, protective. The foal let out a weak whimper, stumbling slightly. It was too cold, too weak to survive much longer out in this weather. Walter knew it, and so did the mare. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the ice. "I ain't gonna hurt ya," he said softly, his voice hoarse from years of little use. "You're a long way from anywhere safe, girl. And that little one ain't got much fight left in him." The mare snorted, ears flicking back. Walter could see the exhaustion in her stance, the slight tremble in her legs. She was running on empty, pushing herself for the sake of her foal. Walter sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "This ain't my fight," he muttered. "Ain't my business." But even as he said it, he knew he couldn't just turn away. If he left them out here, the foal wouldn't make it through the night. And the mother? She'd likely die trying to keep him warm. He glanced back toward the cabin, then at the makeshift barn. An old structure he hadn't used in years, the doors still sturdy enough to keep the worst of the wind out. He had hay stored away, enough to last a few days. Maybe just long enough to get them strong enough to leave. Walter sighed heavily. Damn it, he muttered. Turning back to the mare, he took another slow step forward. Look, he said, voice steady but low. I got food, water, a place for you to rest up. You don't have to trust me, but if you don't come with me, your baby ain't gonna see another sunrise. The mare huffed, shifting her weight. Walter could see the indecision in her dark eyes, the way she was torn between instinct and the reality of her situation. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she took a single step forward. Walter exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. That's it, he murmured. That's a good girl. Slowly, carefully, he took a few more steps back toward the barn, watching as the mare hesitated before following, the foal wobbling beside her. As they reached the barn, Walter pulled open the heavy wooden door. The scent of old hay and weathered wood filled the air, and though the place wasn't much, it was warm. The mare hesitated again at the entrance, but when the foal collapsed in exhaustion, she finally stepped inside. Walter quickly shut the door behind them, sealing out the biting wind. For the first time in years, his cabin wasn't the only place holding life. And for the first time in a long time, Walter didn't feel completely alone. Walter stood inside the barn, the scent of damp wood and aged hay filling his nostrils. The warmth inside was barely enough to keep the chill at bay, but it was better than the merciless cold outside. He turned to look at the two unexpected guests who had wandered onto his land. Sierra, as he decided to call her, and her frail foal, Dakota. The mare remained on high alert, her body tense as she hovered protectively over Dakota. Her dark eyes darted toward Walter every time he made the slightest movement. She didn't trust him, not yet, and he couldn't blame her. Walter let out a slow breath and took a careful step back, giving her space. Easy there, girl, he murmured. Ain't looking to hurt you. Sierra flicked her ears back, but didn't bolt. That was a good sign. The foal, however, barely acknowledged Walter's presence. Dakota lay curled in the hay, his tiny frame shaking from exhaustion. His breathing was uneven, his legs splayed awkwardly beneath him. Walter knew the signs all too well: hypothermia, malnutrition, and pure exhaustion. If we don't do something soon, that little one won't make it, Walter muttered to himself, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm away his own doubts. His instincts told him to act. The horseman in him, the man who had once raised and trained thoroughbreds, knew what needed to be done. But another part of him hesitated. This wasn't his fight. He had built his life away from everything and everyone for a reason. Helping them meant getting involved, forming an attachment, and attachments always led to loss. Sierra shifted her weight, her hooves clinking softly against the frozen floor of the barn. She watched Walter with a mixture of wariness and exhaustion, her muscles twitching every time he moved. I get it, Walter said, almost as if he were speaking to an old friend. You don't trust me, and I ain't gonna pretend you should. But your boy's in bad shape. He turned toward an old wooden shelf where he kept a few supplies, things he hadn't touched in years but never had the heart to throw away. A tattered horse blanket, a rusted tin bucket, an old saddle gathering dust. He found what he was looking for, a small bag of oats he had bought years ago for no particular reason. Walter grabbed a handful and slowly extended his palm toward Sierra. Come on now, girl. You gotta eat something, da. The mare sniffed the air, hesitant. For a long moment, Walter thought she would refuse. But then, slowly, she took a small step forward, her nostrils flaring as she cautiously examined the offering. Then, to his surprise, she lowered her head and nibbled at the oats. Walter let out a breath of relief. That's it. Good girl. The moment was brief, but it was progress. Sierra chewed carefully, still watching Walter like a hawk. But she wasn't pulling away, not yet. Walter turned his attention to Dakota, who had barely moved since they entered the barn. The foal's breathing was still too shallow, his shivers more violent than before. He didn't have much time. Walter cursed under his breath and moved toward a storage chest in the corner of the barn. Inside, he found an old flannel blanket, thick and warm, one that had belonged to his late wife, Margaret. He hesitated for a split second before shaking the thought away. No time for ghosts. He knelt beside Dakota, moving slowly, carefully. The foal barely reacted when Walter draped the blanket over him, tucking it gently around his frail body. The heat would help, but it wouldn't be enough. Walter reached for a nearby bucket, filling it with lukewarm water from a small tank he kept inside the barn. He dipped his fingers into it, testing the temperature. "All right, kid," he muttered, glancing at Dakota. "Let's see if we can get some life back in you." He grabbed a clean rag and gently dabbed the foal's nose with the warm water, trying to stimulate him. Dakota let out a weak whimper but didn't resist. Walter continued, rubbing the foal's legs, trying to encourage circulation. Sierra snorted, stepping forward sharply as if to intervene. Walter froze. The mare's eyes were sharp, filled with silent warning. For a split second, he thought she might kick him straight into next week. Instead, she lowered her head and sniffed Dakota. Her breath was warm against the foal's damp coat, and she let out a soft, worried whicker. Walter sat back on his heels, watching the interaction. "Yeah, I know, girl. You're worried. I am too." He had done what he could for now. The rest would be up to Dakota. Walter sat against the barn wall, rubbing his hands together for warmth. His own exhaustion was creeping in, but sleep would have to wait. He wasn't leaving them alone tonight. For hours, he kept watch, only stepping outside to grab more firewood for the stove in the cabin. Each time he returned, Sierra was still there, standing guard over Dakota. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the barn doors. Another storm was coming. Walter pulled his coat tighter around himself. He had spent years keeping the world at a distance. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. The storm raged on through the night, its icy fingers slipping through every crack and crevice of the barn. Walter sat hunched on an overturned wooden crate, watching the firelight flicker across the old wooden beams. Every now and then, he'd glance over at Sierra and Dakota, making sure the foal was still breathing. The old man had spent enough years with horses to know the fine line between life and death when it came to newborns. Dakota was on the edge. He needed warmth, food, and rest. All things he wouldn't get without help. Walter sighed, rubbing his face with his rough, calloused hands. "Damn it, boy," he muttered under his breath. "You couldn't have wandered into someone else's land?" A gust of wind slammed against the barn doors, shaking them violently. Walter glanced toward the ceiling. This place wasn't built for this kind of cold. The hay was helping, but barely. Dakota's small body trembled beneath the blanket, his breathing shallow. Sierra, despite her exhaustion, remained standing. She nudged the foal gently, nickering softly as if urging him to hold on. Walter knew what that sound meant, a mother's desperation. He let out a long breath. "All right," he said finally, pushing himself up. "We ain't gonna let this cold take you, kid." He walked towards Sierra cautiously, keeping his hands where she could see them. The mare tensed, her muscles twitching as she followed his every move. "I know you don't trust me," he said softly, "but we're out of time. If that little one don't get real warmth soon, he ain't gonna see morning." Sierra's ears flicked back, uncertainty flashing in her dark eyes. Walter took a slow step toward Dakota, kneeling beside the foal. His body was too still. That was bad. With a deep sigh, Walter made his decision. "I'm taking him inside," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "You want to come, girl, you follow?" He gathered Dakota in his arms, the foal barely weighing anything at all. His small frame was stiff with cold, his breathing faint against Walter's chest. It was like carrying a ghost. Sierra let out a sharp snort, stepping forward aggressively, nostrils flaring. Walter didn't move. He let her get close, let her smell him, let her see that he wasn't taking her baby away. He was trying to save him. "You want him to live, don't you?" Walter murmured. Sierra's ears flicked forward, then back again. For a long moment, she stood completely still. Then, to Walter's relief, she took a step back, lowering her head slightly. He didn't wait for a second invitation. Carefully, he turned and carried Dakota through the snow, shielding the foal's frail body from the biting wind. Each step was slow, deliberate. Walter wasn't as young as he used to be, and carrying a foal, even a small one, wasn't easy. Behind him, Sierra followed. She kept her distance, ears pricked, body tense, but she followed. Walter kicked open the cabin door with his boot, stepping inside and closing it quickly behind them. The warmth hit him like a wave. The fire in the stone hearth crackled softly, casting an amber glow across the worn wooden floor. He moved to the old leather couch, lowering Dakota onto the thick wool blanket he had draped over it. The foal barely stirred, his body still trembling. Sierra paced just outside the door, ears twitching, her anxiety evident. Walter exhaled, running a hand down his face. "I know, girl. I know." He grabbed another blanket from the chair near the fireplace, rubbing it briskly over Dakota's body to generate warmth. The foal let out a faint, pitiful whimper, a sound of life. Walter took it as a good sign. "Come on, kid," he murmured. "You got fight left in you." He walked to the front door and pulled it open just a crack. Sierra stood there, pawing at the ground, uncertain. "You coming in or not?" The mare hesitated. The warmth called to her, but the instincts of a wild horse screamed at her to run. Then, she did something that surprised Walter. She took a step forward. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped into the cabin, her hooves clinking against the wooden floor. Her eyes darted around, nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar smells. Walter let out a low chuckle. "Ain't much, but it beats freezin' to death outside." Sierra ignored him, walking straight to Dakota. She lowered her head, sniffing his face, letting out another soft, worried nicker. Walter stepped back, giving her space. He grabbed a small tin bucket and filled it with warm water from the kettle near the fire, placing it near the couch. "Drink up, girl. You need it." Sierra hesitated, but eventually lowered her head and took a few cautious sips. Walter pulled up a chair near the fireplace, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. His whole damn life, he had avoided getting attached. To people, to animals, to anything. And now here he was, sharing his cabin with a wild mare and her half-dead foal. He let out a slow breath, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Well, this ain't how I thought I'd spend my night." He glanced toward the couch, where Dakota was now breathing a little steadier. The foal was still weak, but Walter knew he had a fighting chance now. Sierra stood close, watching over her baby, her big dark eyes occasionally flicking toward Walter with something less than fear and maybe just a little bit of trust. Walter shook his head, smirking to himself. "Guess we're stuck with each other for now, huh?" The warmth of the fire crackled steadily in the cabin, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. Outside, the wind howled mercilessly, rattling the windows as another wave of snowfall blanketed the Montana plains. But inside, the tiny, fragile heartbeat of Dakota was finally steadying. Walter sat on the edge of his worn-out leather chair, watching the foal closely. The old man had been around enough animals to know that survival wasn't guaranteed. Not yet. Dakota was still weak. His legs sprawled awkwardly as he lay on the thick blanket Walter had placed beneath him. His small chest rose and fell with each careful breath, his body still shivering slightly despite the warmth of the fire. Beside him, Sierra stood protectively, her large frame tense as she hovered over her baby. Every time Walter moved, she flicked her ears back, her dark eyes filled with suspicion. "I ain't gonna hurt him, girl," Walter muttered, rubbing his stiff hands together. "I reckon you figured that out by now." Sierra huffed, her breath visible in the warm glow of the fire. She didn't trust him, not entirely, but she wasn't trying to trample him either. A sign that she was, at the very least, considering the idea that he wasn't a threat. Walter sighed and leaned back in his chair. What the hell was he doing? He had spent years avoiding attachment, keeping himself isolated from anything that might make him feel alive again. The loss of his wife, the estrangement from his son. It had all hardened him, turned him into something of a ghost in his own home. But now? Now he had a wild mare and her half-frozen foal laying on his damn couch like some kind of uninvited guests. And the crazy thing was, he didn't hate it. Walter glanced at the old wooden table in the corner of the cabin. The chair across from him sat empty, just like it had for years. It used to be Margaret's spot, back when she was alive. Back when this place felt like a home instead of a tomb. He shook his head, forcing the thought away. "You're getting sentimental, old man," he muttered to himself. Sierra flicked an ear at the sound of his voice, but didn't move. Walter pushed himself up from his chair with a groan, his joints protesting the motion. His legs felt stiff from sitting too long, but there was still work to be done. He shuffled toward the small kitchen, which wasn't much. Just a few cabinets, an old stove, and a chipped sink. He rummaged through a lower shelf and pulled out a can of evaporated milk. "Not ideal," he muttered, examining the expiration date. "But better than nothing." He heated some water, diluting the milk to a warm, thin consistency. Then he grabbed a clean rag, twisting it into a makeshift bottle. Sierra snorted loudly the moment Walter approached Dakota with the rag. "Easy now," Walter said, raising a hand in surrender. "Ain't trying to take your boy. Just trying to get some food in him." The mare pawed at the wooden floor, clearly uneasy, but Walter ignored her. He knelt beside Dakota and gently pressed the soaked rag against the foal's lips. At first, nothing. Dakota barely reacted, his small body still too weak to recognize the food in front of him. Walter frowned, squeezing a bit of the warm liquid into the foal's mouth. "Come on, kid. You gotta help me out here." The foal twitched slightly. Then, after a moment, his tongue flicked against the rag. Walter's lips curled slightly into what might have been the closest thing to a smile he'd had in years. "That's it, boy," he murmured. "You got some fight left in ya." Dakota sucked weakly at the makeshift bottle, drinking just a little at a time. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sierra let out a low whinny, lowering her head to nuzzle her foal. Walter backed off slightly, giving her space. He watched as she gently licked the top of Dakota's head, her way of reassuring him. For a moment, the old man just stood there, watching. Something about the sight stirred something deep in his chest, something he had buried a long time ago. It had been years since he had seen a bond like this, since he had felt one. Walter swallowed hard and turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. "Damn horses," he muttered. "Always making a man feel things he ain't got time for." He busied himself by tossing another log into the fireplace, sending a fresh burst of heat into the room. The storm outside was still raging, but inside the cabin, the world felt warmer. He turned back towards Sierra and Dakota, really looking at them this time. Sierra's coat was a dull, stormy gray, but Walter could tell she had once been a stunning creature. The winter had been hard on her, but there was strength in her frame, a resilience that reminded him of someone. Dakota, despite his weakness, had fire in him. Walter could see it now, that will to survive that separated the ones who made it from the ones who didn't. Walter exhaled. "Guess you ain't just passing through, huh?" he muttered. Sierra didn't respond, of course, but for the first time, she didn't look at him with fear. Walter sighed again and settled back into his chair. He glanced toward the old shelf above the stove where a dusty picture frame still sat. It was an old photo of him, Margaret, and their son, Luke, back when life had made sense, back when he hadn't been so damn alone. Walter let his gaze linger there for a moment before looking back at Sierra and Dakota. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't so alone anymore. The wind outside screamed against the cabin walls, rattling the windows and sending bursts of snow tumbling against the glass. The storm was worsening. Walter had seen plenty of rough Montana winters in his lifetime, but something about this one felt harsher. Inside, the cabin was a small island of warmth in a frozen world. Walter sat in his worn-out chair, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. He had added an extra log to the fire, the flames crackling and throwing an amber glow against the walls. Across the room, Sierra stood protectively over Dakota, her body relaxed but her eyes still carefully watching Walter. The foal, though still weak, was noticeably better. His shivering had lessened, and his breathing had steadied. Walter let out a slow breath. They were going to make it. For now. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed into the cabin, making the walls groan under the pressure. Walter's head snapped toward the door, a gut feeling creeping into his bones. Something wasn't right. He stood, setting his coffee down. Instinct told him to check the barn, even though he had brought the horses inside. The storm was brutal, and the last thing he needed was part of the structure collapsing under the weight of the snow. Sierra lifted her head as he grabbed his coat. "I won't be long," he muttered, slipping his arms into the sleeves. He wasn't sure why he was talking to her, but the cabin wasn't so empty anymore. It felt different now. Walter cracked open the door, and a blast of freezing air hit him like a punch to the face. He cursed under his breath, bracing himself as he stepped onto the porch. The wind was unforgiving, cutting through his coat like a blade. Snow had already piled high against the wooden steps, and he had to trudge through knee-deep drifts to make his way to the barn. His gut tightened as he approached. Something felt off. The moment he unlatched the door, the wind ripped it from his grip, slamming it open with a deafening bang. Walter cursed again, pushing inside and shoving the door closed behind him. He pulled out his flashlight, scanning the interior. Everything seemed fine. The old stalls were empty, save for a few leftover bales of hay. But as he stepped further inside, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Tracks. Not horse tracks. Boot prints. They were fresh, pressed into the snow-covered dirt floor. Walter's pulse quickened. Someone had been here, recently. He wasn't alone. A low creak came from the shadows near the back of the barn. Walter froze. His fingers instinctively moved toward the knife strapped to his belt. He hadn't needed to use it in years, but old habits died hard. The barn was silent now, except for the wind howling through the cracks in the wood. He squinted into the darkness, feeling his heartbeat in his throat. Then, movement. A figure lurched forward from the shadows. Walter barely had time to react before a man, bundled in thick winter gear, stepped into the dim light of his flashlight. He was tall, built like a rancher, with a thick beard and cold eyes. Walter didn't recognize him. The man raised his hands slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't mean to scare you, old man." His voice was rough, carrying the kind of tone that didn't belong to a friendly neighbor. Walter didn't lower his knife. "Funny," Walter said, his voice steady. "Breaking into my barn in the middle of a storm sure as hell ain't a good way to make friends." The man smirked. "I was just looking for shelter." Walter's grip on the knife tightened. "You got boots, you got a coat. You ain't lost. And you sure as hell weren't just looking for a warm place to sit." The man's smirk faded. Silence. Thick, heavy silence. Walter could feel it now, the tension creeping between them, the way the man's eyes shifted ever so slightly toward the knife. Then, the man's gaze drifted toward the cabin, barely visible through the swirling snow. Walter's stomach dropped. He wasn't just here for shelter. "You live out here alone?" the man asked, too casually. Walter didn't answer. Another gust of wind rattled the barn walls, filling the space with a deep, eerie howl. Then, suddenly, a sound from behind them. A low, dangerous snort. The man turned, and before Walter could warn him, Sierra charged. She came out of the darkness like a ghost, her hooves thundering against the wooden floor. The man barely had time to react before she reared up, teeth bared, eyes wild. "Shit." The man stumbled back, barely dodging a strike from her powerful front hooves. He slipped on the snow-covered floor, falling onto his back. Walter stepped forward, his knife still in hand. "You best be on your way," Walter said, his voice like stone. "Or next time, I might not stop her." The man's eyes flicked between Walter and Sierra, who stood like a damn guardian between them, her chest heaving. He didn't hesitate this time. Without another word, he scrambled to his feet and bolted toward the barn door. Walter watched as the stranger disappeared into the storm, his shadow swallowed by the whirling snow. For a long moment, he didn't move. The only sound was the ragged breathing of Sierra, still tense, still ready to fight. Walter exhaled, lowering his knife. He turned toward Sierra, studying her. She had saved him. She had saved the cabin. Walter let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Didn't think you had it in you, girl," Sierra snorted, shaking out her mane, her dark eyes never leaving the barn door. Walter sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. What the hell just happened? One thing was certain, that man wasn't just passing through. And something told Walter he'd be back. Walter didn't sleep that night. Even after securing the cabin, triple-checking the locks, and making sure the fire burned strong. His mind wouldn't let him rest. The stranger, the fresh boot prints in the barn, the way the man's gaze had lingered on the cabin, on Dakota and Sierra. Walter had seen men like that before, opportunists, people who looked at the world and saw things to be taken, not protected. Sierra had chased him off, but Walter knew better than to think it was over. Seated in his worn leather chair, he let out a long, slow breath. What was he doing? For years, he had lived alone, keeping the world at a distance. Safer that way. No risks, no attachments, no one to lose. And now here he was, with a half-wild mare sleeping near his fireplace and a fragile foal curled up on his damn couch. He looked over at Dakota, his small frame still rising and falling steadily. The foal had improved. He was alive. But for how long? Walter reached for the bottle of whiskey he kept on the small wooden table beside his chair. His fingers hovered over the glass, but he didn't pour it. Instead, he just stared at the dark amber liquid. What the hell are you doing, old man? He closed his eyes, his mind dragging him back to a time when this house wasn't so empty. It was years ago, before the loneliness had settled deep into his bones. Margaret was still alive. She had been the one who had talked him into moving to Montana, saying the quiet life suited him better than the chaos of the city. She had been right, of course. She always was. Walter could still hear her laughter, the way she'd tease him about his stubbornness. One of these days, Walter Reed, you're gonna have to stop pretending you don't care about things. I don't pretend, he'd grumble. I just don't waste my time on what ain't gonna last. Then you're wasting your whole damn life. She had been right about that, too. Then came the accident. A truck on an icy road. A hospital phone call in the middle of the night. And just like that, everything was gone. The house went quiet. Their son, Luke, had already been distant before. But after Margaret died, he might as well have been a stranger. Walter had never been good with words, never knew how to say the things that needed saying. So Luke left, moved to Texas, and Walter stayed behind. Alone. And now? Now he had 2 horses in his cabin and a gut feeling that trouble was coming back. Walter let out a long, slow breath, finally pulling his hand away from the whiskey bottle. Not tonight. Instead, he stood and walked toward the couch, where Dakota lay. The foal was awake now, barely, his dark eyes flickering open. He blinked slowly, his small ears twitching at the sound of the wind outside. Walter knelt beside him. "You're tougher than you look, kid." Dakota let out a weak little huff, and Walter couldn't help but chuckle. Across the room, Sierra lifted her head, watching, always watching. Walter turned to her, his voice quieter now. "You did good back there, chasing that bastard off." Sierra flicked her ears, tilting her head slightly as if she understood. Walter exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Guess we're stuck with each other for now, huh?" He didn't know why he said it. Maybe because it felt true. He had spent the last 10 years running from attachments, from anything that could remind him of what he lost. But now? Now, he wasn't completely alone. And for the first time in years, that didn't feel so bad. Morning arrived with a heavy silence, the kind that only came after a relentless storm. Walter sat by the cabin window, staring out at the world buried in white. The snow stretched out for miles, untouched except for the footprints that led from the barn. The ones that didn't belong to him. The stranger. Walter rubbed his hands together, his gut still uneasy. He hadn't seen any sign of the man since Sierra had chased him off, but something told him it wasn't over. Men like that didn't just disappear. Behind him, Sierra snorted softly, shifting on her hooves. She had refused to leave Dakota's side all night, standing near the couch as if guarding him. The foal was stronger today, his ears perking up when Walter approached with warm milk. He was drinking more now, his body no longer shaking violently from the cold. "You're getting there, kid," Walter murmured, gently stroking Dakota's tiny forehead. "Ain't out of the woods yet, but you got some fight in you." Sierra watched, her dark eyes locked onto Walter's every move. There was something different about her today. Less fear, more understanding. Walter stood and stretched, his joints popping. "All right, I gotta check the damn generator before it craps out completely." He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. The wind had died down, but the cold still bit into his skin. Everything was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made his instinct scream. Walter took careful steps through the thick snow, his boots sinking deep. The barn was still intact, no signs of new footprints. But as he turned toward the small shed where he kept the backup generator, his stomach clenched. The lock on the shed was broken. Walter's pulse quickened. He gripped the handle of his knife, his breath coming out in slow, controlled puffs of steam. He pushed the door open, and there it was. The fuel cans were gone. A low curse left his lips. Damn it! The stranger had come back. Walter backed away from the shed, his eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just endless snow and silent pines. But he knew. He was being watched. The feeling prickled down his spine. That instinct he hadn't lost even after all these years. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his steps steady but deliberate. Someone wanted him vulnerable. No fuel meant no generator. No generator meant no backup power if another storm hit. Walter clenched his jaw. If this bastard thought he was just some weak old man living in the middle of nowhere, he was dead wrong. Walter stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. Sierra lifted her head instantly, sensing the tension in the air. Dakota stirred, but remained curled up against the warmth of the blankets. Walter grabbed his old rifle from above the fireplace. He hadn't fired it in years, but he kept it clean, kept it ready. Montana winters could be cruel, and predators didn't just come with four legs. Sierra stamped her hoof, watching him as he checked the weapon. Walter exhaled slowly. We might have company, girl. He pulled back the curtain slightly, scanning the tree-line again. Still nothing, but he knew better. The stranger had taken the fuel for a reason. He was testing Walter, seeing if he'd panic, seeing if he was alone. The bastard didn't know he had company. Walter looked at Sierra, a small smirk tugging at his lips. Reckon he ain't expecting you. The mare flicked her ears, tail swishing. Walter sat back in his chair, the rifle resting across his lap. He had spent too many years avoiding fights, avoiding people, avoiding anything that could make him care again. But these horses? They were his now, and he'd be damned if he let anyone take them. Walter sat in his chair, the rifle resting across his lap, his fingers idly tracing the smooth, worn stock. The fire crackled beside him, casting long shadows on the wooden walls of the cabin. He wasn't a fool. The stranger hadn't just stolen the fuel for no reason. He was testing him, seeing if Walter was alone, seeing if he was weak. And if Walter had learned anything in his 78 years, it was that weakness invited trouble. Sierra stood near Dakota, her body tense, alert. It was as if she could feel the shift in the air, sense the way Walter had slipped into an old mindset he hadn't used in years, the mindset of a man ready to fight. The last time he had held this rifle with serious intent, Margaret was still alive. Back then, it had been wolves. A brutal winter, much like this one, had driven them too close to the property. He had woken one night to the sound of snarling and had stepped outside with his rifle, chasing them off before they could get to the horses. But this wasn't wolves. Wolves were predictable. Wolves were honest in their hunger. Men like the one who had come to his barn, they were worse. Walter leaned forward, rubbing his hands together, thinking, if that bastard thought he was just some old man, alone in the middle of nowhere, then maybe Walter could use that to his advantage. A plan in motion. The snow had settled by mid-afternoon, and the cold was biting, but clear skies meant opportunity. Walter bundled up, grabbed his knife, his rifle, and a length of old rope, and stepped outside. He didn't have to go looking for the stranger. The bastard had left enough clues. Tracks leading away from the barn, up toward the ridge overlooking the valley. Walter had a feeling he'd find something there. Sierra stomped her hoof as he prepared to leave. Walter looked at her, tilting his head slightly. What? You want to come too? She flicked her tail, watching him. Walter let out a dry chuckle. Damare was smarter than most people he knew. He debated for a moment, then grabbed the old leather bridle he hadn't used in years. He approached her cautiously, expecting a fight, but Sierra stood still as he slid the bridle over her head. Well, I'll be damned, Walter muttered, tightening the strap. You ain't just a wild thing, huh? Maybe, once upon a time, she had belonged to someone. Maybe that's why she was still here. With one last glance at the cabin, at Dakota, curled up safe by the fire, Walter swung himself onto Sierra's back. For the first time in years, he was riding again. The ridge and the truth the ride up was slow, deliberate. Sierra's hooves crunched against the ice, carrying Walter up the steep incline toward the ridge. When they reached the top, he saw it. Smoke. A small campfire, just beyond the tree line. Walter stopped Sierra, watching. The stranger was there, crouched near the flames, a makeshift shelter of tarps and branches covering a pile of stolen supplies, including Walter's damn fuel cans. So he wasn't just some lost traveler. He had set up camp. He was planning to stay. Walter exhaled through his nose, gripping the rifle tighter. Now came the real question. What kind of man was this? The kind that could be reasoned with? Or the kind that needed a different lesson? Walter watched for a long time. The stranger moved like someone used to being alone. His hands were rough, his clothes worn but layered smartly against the cold. He wasn't just surviving out here. He was experienced. Walter hated that. It meant he wasn't dealing with some desperate fool. It meant this was trouble. He nudged Sierra forward, her breath clouding in the cold air. They descended the ridge slowly, deliberately, heading straight for the fire. The stranger didn't hear him at first. Not until Sierra's hooves cracked against a fallen branch. The man whipped around, eyes narrowing. His hand went instinctively to the knife on his hip. Walter didn't flinch, didn't stop. He let Sierra take a few more steps before finally pulling her to a halt a few feet from the fire. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, well, the man muttered, rising to his feet. His tone was mocking, amused. Look at you, old man. I thought you'd be shaking in your boots after last night. Walter stayed silent. The man gestured toward the rifle. Gonna shoot me? Walter finally spoke, voice steady. Depends. The stranger smirked. On what? Walter didn't blink. On whether or not you take what's yours and get the hell off my land. The smirk faded slightly. Walter could see the gears turning in the man's head. He was testing him again. Finally, the man sighed dramatically. All right, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Walter said nothing. The man glanced at Sierra. Nice horse. Walter's fingers tightened around the rifle. The stranger grinned, taking a step closer to the fire. Too close. Walter finally moved. He raised the rifle, just enough. Not pointed directly at him. Not yet. Just enough to make his message clear. The stranger stopped. The amusement in his eyes vanished. For the first time, Walter saw it, the cold calculation. This wasn't just some lost drifter. This was a man used to taking things. Walter's voice was low, firm. You think I'm just some old man waiting to die out here? He took a step forward. You think I don't know what a man like you is? The stranger's lips pressed together. Walter tilted his head. Here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna take what's yours, and only yours. You're gonna pack your little campsite, and you're gonna be gone by sundown. The man's jaw tensed. Walter's voice turned cold. And if you're not? He cocked the rifle. The sound echoed through the trees. Sierra snorted sharply, her muscles coiled. The stranger exhaled, his smirk returning, forced this time. You got some nerve, old man, he muttered. Walter didn't respond. He just stared. After a long pause, the man lifted his hands. Fine. He took a step back. But don't think this is over. Walter watched as he turned, started kicking out the fire, packing his things. He didn't lower the rifle until he was sure. Then, with a final glance, Walter nudged Sierra and turned her back toward home. This wasn't over. And he'd be damned if he wasn't ready when the time came. Walter rode Sierra back toward the cabin, his mind turning over every detail of the encounter. The stranger had agreed to leave, but Walter had seen it in his eyes. This wasn't over. Men like that didn't just walk away. The ride back was slow. Walter wasn't a young man anymore, and he hadn't ridden in years. His knees ached from gripping the saddle, and his back protested with every jolt. But Sierra moved with a steadiness that reassured him. She knew. She was listening, reading the tension in his body, the way a good horse always did. As the cabin came into view, Walter let out a long breath. It was still standing. No sign of movement. No tracks in the snow leading up to the door. Good. He slid off Sierra's back with a groan, his legs stiff as he hit the ground. Well, girl, he muttered, running a hand over her neck. Guess we ain't done yet. Sierra flicked an ear and exhaled through her nose. Walter led her back inside the barn, securing the door behind them. He tossed her some fresh hay, giving her a pat on the flank before heading toward the cabin. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately. Dakota lifted his head. The foal's ears perked up slightly, his dark eyes brighter than before. He let out a tiny, weak whinny. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Well, would you look at that? He murmured, stepping toward him. You're feeling better, huh? He knelt beside the couch, checking the foal's legs. The circulation was improving, and the shivering had almost stopped. The kid was fighting. Walter glanced at Sierra, who had settled near the fire. Your boy's a tough one, he muttered. Sierra just watched him, her expression unreadable. Walter stood, stretching out his aching back. The encounter with the stranger had left him tense, his body wound tight with instinct and caution. He walked over to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to look outside. The tree line was empty. No movement, no sign of the stranger. But Walter knew that didn't mean he was gone. He exhaled and rubbed a hand over his face. This was his land, his home. He'd fought too damn hard to carve out a life here, and he wasn't about to let some drifter take it from him. And then there was Sierra and Dakota. He hadn't asked for them, hadn't planned for them. But now, they were his responsibility. And Walter Reed wasn't about to let anything happen to them. Preparing for trouble, Walter moved through the cabin with purpose, checking the locks on the doors and windows. The rifle was cleaned and loaded, but he also grabbed his old revolver from the nightstand, checking the cylinder before slipping it into the waistband of his jeans. He wasn't a violent man, never had been, but he had survived too much to be stupid. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, he had reinforced the barn door, triple-checked the stockpile of firewood, and set up a lantern in the window, just enough to make it look like he was awake, watching. And he would be, because he knew, deep in his gut, that the stranger wasn't done. Not yet. Nightfall. The wind had died down by the time full darkness settled over the land. The snow reflected the moonlight, casting a pale glow across the ground. Walter sat in his chair, rifle across his lap, listening. Sierra lay near Dakota, resting but not sleeping. Her ears twitched at every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind. Outside, the world was silent, too silent. Then, a sound. A soft crunch in the snow. Walter's eyes snapped open. He hadn't imagined it. Another footstep, then another. He stood slowly, gripping the rifle, moving toward the window with deliberate, careful steps. He kept the lantern low, peering out through the curtain, and then he saw it. A shadow moving near the barn. A tall, dark figure, creeping toward the door. Walter's pulse steadied. The bastard had come back. He exhaled slowly, gripping the rifle tighter. You made a mistake, son. Walter turned back toward Sierra and Dakota. Stay put, he muttered under his breath. Then, without another word, he slipped out the back door, disappearing into the night. The night was cold, the kind of cold that settled deep in the bones. Walter barely noticed. His pulse was steady, his breath controlled as he moved through the snow, his rifle held tight in his grip. He didn't rush. The stranger was expecting an easy target, an old man, alone in the wilderness. Walter wasn't that man. He kept to the shadows, moving along the cabin's side, his boots barely making a sound against the frozen ground. The wind was on his side. It masked his movements, carried away the sound of his breathing. The barn door creaked. Walter stopped, waited. Then, a soft grunt. The bastard was trying to get inside. Walter's grip on the rifle tightened. He could end this right now. A clean shot, center mass. He could put this fool in the ground and be done with it. But Walter had spent too many years avoiding fights, avoiding people, avoiding things that reminded him of who he used to be. And now, he was done running. He stepped forward, deliberate, measured. The crunch of his boots in the snow was the only warning the stranger got. The man turned, too late. Walter was already there, rifle raised, barrel aimed at his chest. Step away, Walter said, his voice low and calm. The man froze. His eyes flicked between Walter and the rifle, calculating his chances. Walter didn't give him time to decide. You move, I pull the trigger. The man laughed, a short, cold sound. You ain't gonna shoot me, old man. Walter cocked the rifle. The sound was deafening in the silence. The stranger's smirk faltered. You want to bet on that? Walter asked, his voice like steel. The two men stood there, facing each other, the barn door hanging open behind them. The wind howled, snowflakes swirling between them like ghosts. Walter took a slow step forward. You should have walked away when you had the chance. The man's jaw clenched. I was just looking for supplies. Bullshit. Walter's grip didn't waver. You took my fuel. You came back for more. The stranger exhaled sharply. Frustration. Maybe even fear. You got food in there, don't you? The man muttered, nodding toward the cabin. Got yourself a real nice setup. Just you out here living like some kind of hermit. Walter's stomach turned. The way the man was eyeing the cabin, he wasn't just looking for food. He had seen Dakota. He had seen Sierra. Walter took another step forward, his finger resting just beside the trigger. You got 5 seconds to walk away. The man didn't move. Walter didn't blink. 4. The wind picked up. The barn door rattled against the frame. 3. The stranger's fist clenched. Walter could feel it, the moment before a man makes a choice. 2. Then, the bastard lunged. Walter didn't hesitate. He didn't fire. Not yet. But he swung the rifle up, fast and hard. Crack. The wooden stock slammed into the man's jaw, sending him stumbling back into the snow. He cursed, reaching for something, a knife. Walter lifted the rifle again. This time, he aimed for real. The man froze. You even think about it, Walter said. His voice quiet, and I'll put you in the ground. The man spat blood into the snow. His lip was busted, his breathing heavy. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, finally, the stranger let out a slow, bitter chuckle. You really think you're gonna scare me off? Walter's eyes were ice. I don't care if you're scared. The man wiped his mouth, staring at him. Then, finally, he took a step back. Another. Then he turned. Walter didn't lower the rifle until he was gone. He waited, counted the seconds, listened to the wind carry the sound of fading footsteps. Then, and only then, did he exhale. His breath came out slow, controlled. His hands didn't shake. Walter Reed had spent the last 10 years living like a man with nothing left to lose. Now, he had something worth fighting for. The aftermath. Walter returned to the cabin, bolting the door behind him. He stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then, movement. Sierra stood near the fire, watching him. Dakota stirred on the couch, blinking up at him sleepily. Walter ran a hand down his face. Damn horses. He moved toward Dakota, checking on him. The foal nuzzled into his palm, warm and safe. Walter exhaled. Maybe he wasn't alone out here, after all. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you watched until now, comment, I watched until here, and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video on the end screen. It's really exciting.